out your notebook. There's more. Welcome to CN Live, episode 10. I'm Joe Loria.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss.
On tonight's show, we will discuss the more than 100,000 people, actually more than 1 million people around the world. Most of school children went on strike today to prod governments into action to stem the ever more dangerous rising temperatures that risk the futures of many of those students. We'll discuss the current state of the crisis with a climate activist, a leading climate activist. And another story we will look at is the U.S. media is obsessed with a new scandal involving Donald Trump and conversations he had with the Ukrainian president. We will consider whether there is any substance to this story so far, or is this just another superficial attempt to try to impeach Trump like the collapsed collusion caper? And finally, we'll look at the attack on Saudi oil installations and the potential U.S. response with two Middle East experts.
But first, the headlines. Imprisoned WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange's health is reported to be in even greater decline as he remains isolated in Belmarsh prison in the UK. Meanwhile, the US government says it wants to confiscate any profits whistleblower Edward Snowden makes on his newly published memoir because it says he violated a non-disclosure agreement. An Italian journalist, Stefania Marizzi, lost a court ruling on a FOIA request for all correspondence between UK Crown Prosecution Service and authorities in the US and Sweden relating to the proposed extradition of Assange. We will discuss these developments right after the headlines.
Millions of people in 150 countries around the world left work on Friday to raise their voices against governments who are failing to adequately address the climate crisis. 1 million New York City school children were let out of school, and about 250,000 of them marched to the tip of Lower Manhattan, where activist Greta Thunberg told them, "Together, united, we are unstoppable."
Speaker of the U.S. House, Nancy Pelosi, said Friday that if Trump tried to extort a foreign leader for political gain, it is an impeachable offense. Pelosi has been opposed to impeachment until now. Trump is being accused of asking Ukraine's opponent for an investigation into Joe Biden's activities in that country.
The U.S. Secretary of Defense on Friday said that the U.S. was sending more troops and air defense systems to defend Saudi Arabia and the UAE. That was nearly a week after a significant attack on Saudi oil installations, knocking out about half of Saudi oil production.
We look first at the latest developments in the case of Julian Assange, and we are joined from the San Francisco Bay Area by radio host Peter B. Collins. Julian Assange's mother, Christine Assange, tweeted in the past few days, quote, Julian Assange in solitary confinement in Belmarsh, UK Supermax, in health ward, only transported in and out of cell under controlled moves, prison lockdown, halls cleared, unable to call parents or US lawyer for 6 months, prison not delivered mail for over a month. Peter, what is your take on these latest developments, both in terms of Christine Assange's tweet on the matter and also the news from Stefania Marizzi, the Italian journalist who said that she had lost her effort to get this FOIA material from the UK Crown Prosecution Service?
It's very clear that the British courts are, I think, answering to the US government and not to their own standards. We know that under the British rules that Julian Assange has completed his sentence for bail jumping. Now, it was nominally 50 weeks, which would have put it into March next year, but I suspect there's good time credit, and also it's a minor offense, so it's not a surprise that that is behind him now. But the judge made it equally clear that she used the term absconding. She felt that he was a flight risk if released. Now, this contradicts the reports of his precarious health. And the idea that he is a flight risk when his health clearly seems to have declined, I don't know that it's at the point where we would call it critical, but he certainly seems to be suffering quite a bit. And I am not prepared to judge the medical facilities that are offered in prison at Belmarsh, but it appears that he doesn't have access to them or sufficient medical services if there is a full hospital there. We know that, and it's interesting when you read the accounts in the American corporate media, they act like he's faking it when he appears by video link at these hearings. And the judge asked him if he understood the proceedings, and his answer was not really. And then he added that maybe his lawyers will be able to explain it. I don't know if that reflects cognitive, deficiencies in Julian Assange, or if it was a confusing proceeding and he was uncertain about what it all meant. I think the bottom line here is we know that he is already being punished without being tried or convicted, and that's consistent with our process at Guantanamo Bay, where we're 18 plus years on in this odyssey, and they're hoping to get the 9/11 accused on trial by 2021. So it's unfortunately, this is the system that we have that is captive to the influence of the security and intelligence communities in both countries.
Speaking of that, Peter, I need to interrupt you just to talk
Sure,
about
sure.
Snowden for a minute.
Uh-huh.
His book came out this week, his memoir, and the U.S. government said that they would try to take all of the proceeds from that book, any revenue, because he broke his non-disclosure agreement. In other words, he was supposed to submit the book for review by the intelligence agency, by the CIA, and I guess the NSA, both of which he worked for. My view is that what are they doing here? This is purely punitive, in my opinion, because he's already revealed so much out there. What could be in his book that he hasn't given to the world already, showing mostly that the Fourth Amendment was violated, but with mass surveillance. What's your take on that, Peter?
Well, first of all, he got a wave of free publicity as a result of this. It makes his book, I think, more appealing to many people to basically know that the CIA is attempting to interfere with its publication. Snowden, let me also note, Joe, that you published an important piece recently that was a sharp critique of the work of The Guardian and how they were very strong going into the Snowden affair. And Glenn Greenwald, of course, was leading that as a columnist for The Guardian. Then he left the paper. They submitted to control by GCHQ. They destroyed, at least for show, hard drives and laptop computers. And I find it ironic that The Guardian bought the rights to excerpt Ed Snowden's book. And they are promoting it as if, they didn't change their posture and that they're still gung-ho on Project Ed. So that hypocrisy, I think, has to be noted.
But there might be divisions within the paper on that too.
That's possible.
Yeah.
Also, in one of the first pieces that The Guardian ran, they quote Snowden as saying that he has already pocketed the advance for the book, and that he pretty well expected that they would make some effort to either block publication or grab the proceeds. So Ed has improved his game. I criticized him as a bad fugitive. I support his whistleblowing, and I think he's quite an honorable man in that respect. But he was a lousy.
You can applaud his book contract negotiating too. He seems to have gotten it all at the front end, which was pretty smart.
Yeah. So I think this is par for the course. We saw that CIA officials are permitted to publish books. Who is it? Jose Rodriguez, who destroyed the torture videotapes. He published a book, and as I recall, he didn't have to submit, or there were no redactions to it. It was one or the other. In any event, this is par for the course, and we have brazen leaks by officials described by the Post as former intelligence officials this week, driving this dribbling leak of the whistleblower scandal. And, there is something there. I want to acknowledge that Trump does appear to have tried to pressure the Ukrainians.
Oh, we're going to get to that. Yeah, we're going to get to that in a second. I wanted to finish discussing the Snowden and Assange situation. I've learned from a source fairly close to Assange that the reason they put him in this hospital ward is he is ill, but they are really isolating him from other prisoners because they're afraid that another prison video might leak out. That really got him into a lot of trouble and really ticked them off. So they're punishing him. And of course, we mentioned on our show last week that he was denied bail before his lawyers even asked for it. And he will remain in this maximum security prison, Peter, until the extradition hearings are over. That's my understanding, which is not normally the case. Normally, if you're in an extradition hearing, you're in a different type of facility altogether, not this Belmarsh high security prison, where he's not committed any violent crime. He's never been accused of that. What does that tell you, Peter? And what do you think about that?
Well, I just feel that this is the way that we treat, those who whistle blow without proper approval or without, the official capacity to do so. And that's why I was shifting to the whistleblowing story related to Ukraine, because it's driven by official whistleblowers who will never face any kind of sanction like Chelsea Manning and Ed Snowden and Julian Assange.
Just a second, Peter. Elizabeth, we just want to wrap up our conversation about Assange.
Absolutely.
And then we can move on to this Ukraine story, which is quite interesting. I do want to get Peter's take on that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would just like to add that just recognize the fact that, we have Kristen Hafrenson, obviously editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, telling Aaron Mate recently that basically he's saying that Assange is in a worse condition now than he was when he was in the embassy, essentially. And that he added that they are at Belmarsh, they're making it impossible for him to prepare his legal case against U.S. extradition. So I think that's of concern. And I just wanted to, recognize that that's something that was said by Hafrenson recently. That's new information in terms of him recognizing this, block or this prevention of Assange being able to prepare his legal case, as well as, of course, the news about Maritzi being, basically denied this FOIA about the legal, the documentation relating to the legal procedure against Assange in the UK as well. So basically very bad news, but we don't want to let that bad news go unrecognized and, go without discussion of it, because obviously this is such an important case for journalism in general, for, human rights in general, as we all know. So.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Peter, you could introduce the Ukraine subject since you've been itching to do that. So please.
Well, I do see parallels here. And I talked to Bill Binney, the former NSA technical director, yesterday, and he was laughing at this kind of amateur hour performance. And let me say that if it weren't so important, I would call it hilarious in every respect. Because, on the Trump side, he gave a press conference and, imposed on the Australian Prime Minister to tell people that he doesn't know the identity of the whistleblower, but he flatly called that person partisan. And then he acted as if he didn't know it was about Ukraine after Rudy Giuliani was on CNN last night, first denying that this had anything to do with Biden and Hunter Biden, and then kind of gleefully admitting, oh yeah, that's what we're up to. So, we have these leaks that come from the intelligence community. When I asked Bill Binney, I read him the quote from the Post that the story was based on leaked information from two former intelligence officials. I said, got any suspects? And he immediately said Clapper and Brennan. And of course, we don't know that. That's certainly speculative. But it does appear that they've been driving this whole thing. And I'd like to roll back 1 week to the piece that Scott Ritter wrote that you published this past Monday about the Smolenkoff episode the week before. because I think there's a connection between them. I think these are efforts to, try to stoke the embers of Russiagate and maintain for the portion of the population that bought that narrative that it's real and that it matters, and that Rachel Maddow is relevant again. And on the other hand, there is the nub of a story. We've known for a long time that Joe Biden intervened with the Ukrainian government, got a prosecutor to back off from investigating the energy company where Hunter Biden sits on the board of directors. And so that is a legitimate line of investigation, in my opinion.
Right.
But
Peter, let me interject again right here,
Sure.
because I think it's important to back up to 2014. There was an American-backed coup. I don't think there's any doubt about that. We know that from the leaked conversation of Victoria Nuland, as Secretary of State, European Affairs, and the U.S. ambassador at the time, Jeffrey Piat, in which they talked about midwifing this thing. How do we bring a new government into power? The M word, not the F word everyone was talking about. She used that in relation to the European Union. The midwifing. This was an American-backed coup. That was in February of 2014. In May of 2014, Hunter Biden, the son of the sitting vice president of the United States, gets on this board, as well as a good friend of John Kerry's stepson, also get on this board. I mean, this seems to be classic neo-colonial. You overthrow a government, you install your regime. They even put an American citizen who was a State Department official as the finance minister of Ukraine. They made her a Ukrainian citizen the day before. And then they bring Biden in, and Biden's son, that gets this job. After the overthrow, would he have gotten that job if Yanukovych was still in power? I mean, this is so corrupt. Now, if Trump is asking Zelensky, the current president of Ukraine, to look into that, and the other thing you mentioned, Peter, I'll let you go on again about that, to back the prosecutor to back off this thing, that is highly, totally legitimate. If he was saying, do that, and I'll give you some foreign aid, that is totally routine, whether it's legitimate or not. That's how the U.S. conducts foreign policy. Believe me, that's how they do that. So that's nothing new there, if it's seedy and unseemly. And if Trump was simply doing this to get dirt on his political opponent, possible opponent in next year's election, Joe Biden, well, that's American politics as it's routinely practiced. That's what they do. This is what Hillary Clinton did to try to get Trump on dirt on Trump through Christopher Steele. So he was trying to get some information about his opponent. Does it look good? No. Is it an impeachable offense? All I've heard so far, Peter, is that he's accused of improper conversation. And where is that in the statutes of the U.S. law books as a crime? What the hell is an improper conversation?
Well, this seems to be another effort to, using the old term that Dan rather liked, to necklace Donald Trump. And, let me just be clear for anybody who doesn't know me or my politics. I share my opinions all the time. I don't support Trump. I'd love to see a trapdoor or some other way of ejecting him. But I will not tolerate this kind of deep state interference in domestic affairs and this ongoing effort to take down a president who I don't particularly regard as legitimate, but he's installed.
By the people, by the way, by the people, the voters. And I second that. Anybody who reads conservative news and knows my views, I am opposed to almost everything Donald Trump does or says, except on North Korea and Russia, basically. But everything else is utter disaster. But I totally second what you say, that the people voted him in. We hope they vote him out, but he's in there now, and you don't want this type of maneuver to try to bring him down. Impeach him on some real legitimate crime. Find something legitimate on him. I'll back it. I think most Americans would.
This is the conundrum, all right? As Elizabeth told us, Nancy Pelosi has finally decided that she's found an impeachable offense in this unproven episode. We still have, a lot of investigation to do to understand the dimensions here. And Trump could help us all, like he could have along the way, with his presidential power to declassify materials. And he could put the intercept of his phone call out there right now if he wanted to. But Pelosi's selective approach to impeachment, when you have the clear-cut case of Mike Cohen, who took a guilty plea, named individual one as the guy who instructed him to pay the hush money to Stormy Daniels and the Playboy Playmate, And, that to me is a clear impeachable offense that doesn't require the Russiagate narrative or any foreign meddling or any of that stuff. And she will not pull the trigger. And I understand the calculation, but I reject the calculation. It's not about calculation. If you really believe this man has broken the law, impeachment is the appropriate remedy. And let it play out. See if it does attract more support from the public. See if it could actually shift the chemistry in the U.S. Senate. But to be delaying, deferring, and avoiding impeachment, and then latching on to this as a way to suddenly pivot, I don't find very convincing.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree with both of you. I think I would just echo your stance on that. I think that, you can disagree with Trump all day long and disagree that a quote improper conversation is grounds to impeach a president. I think that basically what this tells me in a bird's eye view type of sense is that, as we've said 1,000 times before on this program, and also as pointed out by Consortium News in general, the Democrats really seem not to have learned from the Trump presidency from 2016. They seem really determined to go into 2020 screaming Russia, screaming whatever they can about Trump, rather than actually promoting a candidate that would genuinely beat Trump. So I think that basically this is more of the same from the Democrats, and it doesn't surprise me at all. It disappoints me, it continues to disappoint me, but it doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things we've got to identify the media malpractice here. And the Washington Post broke the story. MSNBC piled on. And I happened to be actually reading the Post story and watching Rachel Maddow at the same time the other evening. And I kept my dinner down too. It's remarkable. But you can see them pulling together these threads, immediately looking at the list of people who Trump had phone calls with and saying, yeah, it was that Putin call. And so for about a 36-hour period, all of the speculation on MSNBC was centered on Putin and Russia. And that allowed them to bring in Smolenkov and recycle the week before. It allowed them to, bring in extraneous issues like the delay of the sentencing of Mike Flynn and his kind of shift into becoming a victim. But on Thursday, there was a post at the MSNBC Rachel Maddow blog, and it tied a completely unrelated episode of buffoonery by Trump to the unraveling, or whatever you want to call it, whistleblower story. And Trump went to the border. He came out here to California, pick up a lot of campaign cash, and he went down to visit his wall. And in fact, it's a replacement barrier of something that was there before. So he's there with an Army Corps of Engineers general, and Trump is bragging, in his salesman mode. And he said, this fence is wired, the wall is, so that we'll know if somebody's trying to break through. And then he asked the Army Corps General, Todd Semonite, to explain more. And he said, well, sir, there could be some merit in not discussing that. So this is used as an example of Trump playing fast and loose with intelligence, like the claim that, he spilled the beans about Israeli intelligence from Syria to the Russian foreign minister, when in fact that material was declassified at that point. And this is another way that the corporate media is, just using whatever's available to try to make Trump look bad.
And now they're going to call him an anti-Semonite. That was his name?
Yes.
General Semonite? Yeah, okay.
So the lengths that they go to try to connect dots that are completely unrelated just shows the emptiness of their reporting. And it is, unfortunately, propaganda. And there are too many people who watch it and too many people who believe it.
I have one last question I'd like to ask you, Peter, and that is, to what extent do you think, despite these calls to impeach that we've heard all the way through from Mueller's, special investigation, all the way through to this latest kind of faux scandal, to what extent do you think they are completely empty threats? Do you think that the Democratic establishment would rather see a Trump 2.0, another term of Trump, in order to kind of, wail emptily rather than, put forward concrete policy changes of their own? Do you think that they, are serious about wanting to impeach Trump, or is it just kind of an empty threat?
Well, let's separate the party leadership from some of those who are more in touch with the rank and file. Pelosi makes a huge miscalculation by believing that avoiding impeachment will allow the wobbly people who were elected in 2018, who comprised the majority that made her speaker, to hold on to their seats. And we've seen that when Trump goes on a Twitter storm against the squad, and now Beto O'Rourke was well-meaning about buybacks and confiscation of assault weapons, but that is a soundbite that will haunt the Democrats all the way through next November. And his ability to divide people, to change the subject, to hurl globs of shit like an orangutan at the zoo, and make it stick to people, I think they completely underestimate that. And they imagine that if we just go along and don't poke the bear too much, like Bob Corker used to say, that there's this guy, Harley Ruda, who got elected in Orange County. He was a Republican until about a month before he filed papers to run as a Democrat. And so these are the people Pelosi is trying to protect. And I think that she's just wrong in believing that, avoiding the responsibility that I think the House has is going to give her an extra 2 years as Speaker. And she's already agreed with the caucus that she won't serve past 2022. So this is short-term survival instinct on her part, but I just think she's wrong. And for those who don't know me, I'm here in San Francisco. I've known Nancy Pelosi since she originally went to Congress. She was like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez when she first got there, and she was pissing off the White House routinely by opposing most favored nation status for China because of their human rights record. She has changed a lot. And let me just quickly cite a story that Bill Binney told me yesterday and gave me permission to use it publicly. He was present at the meeting in the fall of 2001 when the initial domestic surveillance of Americans was proposed and approved, the Stellar Wind program. She was on the Intelligence Committee, and she was one of the so-called Gang of Four who was briefed on that. And I thought she just passively allowed it to go forward, but Binney was there, and he said that she affirmatively approved that plan. And he believes that's what has compromised her about impeachment all along, that she couldn't support impeachment for Bush because she was vulnerable to some of the same accusations. So to get back to your question, I think that there are some Democrats who really support impeachment. It's more than half of the caucus now. But there are too many corporate Democrats and these former Republicans who operate from a position of fear. And that's what is producing this divide. And we saw, I mean, Corey Lewandowski came in there like Hulk Hogan the other day and put on a wrestling match. And he won. He showed that the Democrats do not have the wherewithal and just the juice to really take this on and make impeachment a real and credible process.
Thank you very much, Peter, for joining us. I thought that Elizabeth's observation was a very good one, that instead of talking about the issues that Americans care about, and then nominating someone who will address those issues, health insurance, employment, housing, our in perpetual warfare, they are wasting all this time going after this guy as if that's going to get them. That failed last time. They have not learned their lesson. Peter, thank you. And I do think, by the way, to answer your question, Elizabeth, I think they'd rather see Trump in a second term than a really progressive a president like Sanders, let's say, relatively speaking, like Sanders, because he may go after their own class interests. And Trump's one of them when it comes to that. So, Peter, thanks for joining us. We're going to move on to another topic now, and have a good weekend. We're going to turn now to climate change. It's the first time we've addressed this subject, and we chose today, of course, because today was the day of the climate strike, and maybe 1 million people or more around the world went on strike today, mostly school children, to raise the alarm even higher on climate change and tell governments what they need to do. And this is what it looked like in Sydney, Australia on Friday, as it was filmed by CNN Live executive producer Cathy Vogan.
Extra, extra, read all about it. Climate change is real and there's no doubt about it.
This land is and always has been traditional Aboriginal land.
Always was, always will be traditional Aboriginal land.
The only well-paid job opportunities currently available for Aboriginal people in our communities are in the mines. We want jobs looking after our land, not destroying them.
I didn't realise how close to home this climate change thing really was for me. I didn't realise that not having a homeland and not being able to set foot on my island homes could actually become a reality. I didn't know that I could do anything about this. I have a right to set foot on my islands. My generation and the generations to come have a right to stand on the same soil that our ancestors did. We have a right to see and experience all the beauty our mother islands have to give. So today and every day after this, I'm going to protect this right. We are going to continue to stand and fight for our islands. We are not drowning, we are fighting.
We are not drowning, we are fighting. We are not drowning, we are fighting. We are not drowning, we are fighting.
Australia should be ashamed of their support for Adani. Australia should be ashamed of ignoring the Indigenous people of this land for economical gain. Australia needs to stop picking profits over people. Australia needs to stop Adani and stop any of the new coal mines from opening. Australia needs to phase out of all coal and burning production. End fossil fuel subsidies and start that rapid transition to renewable sources of energy. Australia needs to join us in this fight against climate change. Be the matangi malohi that pushes us forward. We are strong winds in this movement. We are matangi malohi. I'm going to get my family up here to help me out with this one, okay? And all of you as well, if you can catch on. We are not drowning.
We are fighting.
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 As I speak, not one of our cranes is moving in our workplace. Public servants have locked up their posts. We have workers here from manufacturing sites, from building sites, from the community services, all here today. All of those companies rely on ordinary workers like me and you to run their production, to keep their conveyor belts working, to keep their trucks and trains loaded, to keep their profits flowing. We have the power to put a stop to all of that. Justice, workers' rights, one struggle, one fight. Let our collective voices be heard right across this planet. Let's make sure politicians of all ilk understand that their job security is at risk, and let's they start making change now. Continue to struggle, continue to fight, we will win!
Indigenous people need to be at at the lead of the fight for climate justice. We need to force change and be part of the change to save our planet and our communities. We need for something to happen now, not later. That sort of action would include to stop coal and gas projects, to stop thieving the only water left in the country, and to stop burning coal. As Kamilaroi people, everything we are and do relies on climate justice starting today.
Climate action is our mission. We need a just transition. Climate action is our mission. We need a just transition.
I've got a message for our Prime Minister, that's Scott Morrison. But the reality is this, he doesn't care about you and me, he doesn't care about the planet. So I want to send him a real message. Global warming is happening, Scott, and climate change is real.
We're joined by Arn Menconi. He is former, he's run for Congress. Is that right, Arn?
I've run for U.S. Senate. I've run for Congress. I was a county commissioner. I've been arrested in Washington, New York. I ran a youth activist charity for 21 years.
And what state are you living in now?
I'm living in Colorado.
And that's where you ran for office?
Yes.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today on
Thank
CN
you.
Live. Just tell us what are your thoughts and feelings about today's strike?
It's very emotional. I was speaking today in a small town of 7,000 to almost 200 people, students. My 13-year-old son was in the audience. I watched the newsreels today. We watched 4 million kids all over the world, 163 countries pouring out. As I said in my speech, the kids started the fight, but the adults have to finish the fight. Ironically, it's 5 years ago this week, tomorrow, that was the People's Climate March, where there were a couple of million people marching all over the world. And I almost got arrested on Flood Wall Street 5 years ago when 2,000 people took over Wall Street to stop what we're trying to stop right now, which is the global warming. And the IPCC report that came out last year said we only have 12 years left. Well, in fact, Greta said to Congress yesterday, we only have 8.5 years left. And I would submit we even have less than that. So what I'm thinking about, what I'm feeling today is we've had this amazing awareness brought to the attention of the globe today and our leaders. Now we have to go to next steps, which is action and which is radical movement and getting out in the streets and pressing our politicians to create change.
You describe a number of the measures that could be taken politically and otherwise to create that kind of change. Can you, especially in your recent article that was published with Consortium News, can you run us through a few of those measures that you described there for our viewers?
Yeah. Do you mind if I back up and just frame
Sure,
this? Because
absolutely.
what I watch on Twitter so frequently is climate scientists still talking about the problem or talking about aspirations. And you could almost see this conversation evolving in the matter of a week. Every week, new information comes out. Every week, a new type of piece from scientists. So this week, scientists came out from France and said by 2100, and this is important for our listeners, is that by 2100, we're trying to keep global warming by 1.5 degrees. That means we have to cut our emissions by 80% by 2030, and then the remaining by 2050. There's a 67% chance of that happening. What the scientist from France said this week is chances are we can hit 8 to 10 degrees Celsius by 2100. Think about our own body temperature rising 1 degree, 2 degree. What this whole conversation is about, that since 1850, global temperatures because of man-made CO2 emissions has risen 1 degree. The Earth's land is already at 2 to 3 degrees. Next week, on the 25th, the ocean report comes out. Last month was the agriculture and forestation report. So we don't have to be climate scientists to understand that we're past stage 4 cancer. And we've got to stop being what I said to my daughter, who's 14, stop being dinosaurs standing in puddles of water, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. So let's talk about and so what I'm trying to get to, thank you, is the solutions. Now there's 100 solutions in the Project Drawdown that we could go to. Many of the top 10 that are discussed is, number one, to stop the subsidization of oil and gas by our government. And another frame that people should understand is we're almost 5% of the world's population. We emit almost 15% of the world's CO2 emissions, all right? Another would be that we take whatever dollar amount you want to hear. Bernie Sanders in his Green New Deal talks about $16.3 trillion. Elizabeth Warren talks about $3 trillion. It's a number between 0 and something. I would submit it would cost in the teens of trillions of dollars so that we could get over to solar energy, hydro, clean energy, renewable energy, so that we could get off of our addiction to fossil fuels, that we would stop all types of drilling, that we would ban fossil fuel. Oddly enough, one of the number one causes of fossil fuel is air conditioning and the methane gas that comes out of air conditioning. Another that you'll hear often is that all of our buildings is one of the major producers of CO2 emissions. So we would have to take those trillions of dollars and refit all of the buildings so that they are not emitting CO2 emissions. I could continue if you want. I have a list, and I'm going to go to some of these. But I've talked about the 100% of electrical grid, clean fuel standards. That would mean going over to mainly transportation of buses. You may have heard that Amazon, oddly enough, is saying that they're going to have a goal to get over to energy efficiency buses. So we talk about transportation, we talk about building, and we talk about the type of electric that we use. And then the fourth category is that we have to look at the way we get our food systems. And that is, I'm vegan. I'm not going to get into this silly conversation about whether or not we have hamburgers or don't have hamburgers. It's the fact that our agricultural system and the stripping of the land for agriculture and the deforestation of it is causing much of the CO2 emissions. So we have, those are 4 areas that our legislators have to go after. And I would say that a solution, being a former elected official, knowing all, I knew very well Secretary of State Ken Salazar when he was Attorney General. I knew U.S. Senator Mark Udall, and I know U.S. Senator Michael Bennet. These people, especially Ken Salazar, is now working for Anadarko and trying to protect the fracking industry. So we have to go after the neoliberal Democrats, in my opinion, having studied this for almost 20 years, and in the last 5 years, really working as an activist to say they're lying. They're taking money from the oil and gas industry, and we have to prove to them that they're telling us that they're working on some types of solutions, but in fact, they're not.
In fact, that's the heart of the matter, Arn, isn't it? Greed,
Yes.
American style capitalism,
Yeah.
and no regard for the consequences.
I stopped because I have a whole litany, Joe, about
Go on.
this.
Go on, Arn, please.
Well, thank you. I would
Carry
love
on.
to, because
Carry on.
I think what the climate scientists, I mean, just to get wonky for a second, whenever you're talking about this type of conversation, you have to think in terms of the different areas that we're talking about. We're talking about the type of economic system that we're in, the capitalist system, this unfettered capitalism that's in late stage capitalism, is why we're at this level right now. And anyone who is a parent or loves children has to be very emotional about what's going on right now, because the news that we got last October is there's no more time left on the clock. The other element or pillar that we have to talk about is our political system. And as everyone knows, we do not have a democracy. We have an oligarchy, or we have an inverse totalitarian state, or what I like to call, we're run by the global corporate mafia. Then we have to look at our natural systems, and then we have to look at the people and the individuals. So what I would say to people is 70% of the CO2 emissions in America is produced by 100 companies. We need to go after those 100 companies and holding them accountable. We have to go after the Democratic Party. Stop talking to the deniers, talk to the delayers, talk to the people who are giving us incrementalism. You know, I would submit that incrementalists are today's flat earthers. If you think that we're going to be able to buy some time by rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic with this word that you keep hearing about, transition over to renewable, we can't. We don't have time to do that. We need the type of thing that, I hate this example, but World War II or the Depression, the type of sacrifices that we have to make.
I like the fact that you bring up the level of responsibility that so many corporations have in this, because I think a lot of people wrongly put it all themselves as a small individual, saying, well, if I change my light bulbs, I'm doing all I can, and it's all my fault if I don't have the right car, when really it's not only the corporations you mentioned, it's also the war infrastructure, so many
Yes.
other, as well as the agriculture that you mentioned. I think it's great that you did bring up the point about animal agriculture, deforestation, and all of that. But please continue. Sorry to interrupt.
Well, no, please, you have to interrupt me, because I mean, I was an anti-war activist. I went out and said, we can't go back into the Middle East. I had been to Washington some 50 times since 2000. I knew the hallways, I knew these people, and I said, we're going back in against ISIS. I don't believe it. They tried to recall me when we went into Afghanistan in 2001 as a county commissioner, because I said, no, we're being irrational here. Here we are 18 years later. So the other part I want to talk about that never gets talked about enough, or barely at all, is this is our military, industrial, congressional, security, media complex at work here. We are bombing 8 countries. We are in 8 countries with our military. I worked with Daniel Ellsberg on his latest book, Doomsday Machine, and he would say to you that it wasn't the military industrial complex. They're protecting our mercantile interests. If it's in South America, if it's in China, wherever it is, and it's going to be the Antarctic pretty soon as the ice melts there. So in most of my lifetime, it's been the Middle East for oil. And we're watching what happens with the Saudi Arabia losing 25% of their, help me out here, their oil refineries, 25%. It shows us how easy it is to lose the type of thing that we've become addicted to for our cars, et cetera. So what people have to understand is That's that $4 to $5 trillion, $6 trillion that was spent on the Middle East. The $22 trillion that weren't accounted for on the day before 9/11 that we were talked about. The fact that there's never been an audit on the military. And then we have to listen to these stupid forums, 7-hour forums where they take 22 minutes of information and squeeze it into 7 hours about what type of solutions, never talking about the military, but talking about hamburgers, talking about straws, talking about whether or not we're going to change our light bulbs. So, this is what Stephen Hawkins talks about, why we're doomed. Stephen Hawkins said in 2016, we're doomed because of our greed and our stupidity. And it's our job right now, I believe, as a parent, I don't have hope, I have kids, that we have to get this narrative straight. We have to explain the time left on the clock is next to nothing. That the solution right now is you can look at it as an international issue. That's pretty difficult. Let's make it a little less difficult. We have to go after our candidates who are running for office, who are going to spend some $200 billion in the next year running for either president, US Senate, the 33 candidates running for US Senate. And by the way, Colorado is the #1 toss-up state in the country. And then you have to go after your Congress people. Forget everything else, I would say, except I live in the state of Colorado. In the state of Colorado, we have a Democratic governor, Jared Polis, we have a Democratic Senate, and we have a Democratic House. And they're passing these stupid bills that are making us believe that they're going to curb our appetite on the industry of fracking. And I won't get into all of the details, but there's an investigative story right there. This is an oil and gas bought state. The #1 candidate running for US Senate in Colorado is John Hickenlooper. His nickname is Frackenlooper. And everybody is running behind this guy because they don't want to have Cory Gardner. I mean, this is the reality. If this is what I told the kids, your parents will come into your room and say, hey, you have to clean up this mess. It's time for you to go to your parents' consciousness and say, you made this mess. You have to clean this up. You have to speak truth to power. And that means you're going to have to make major sacrifices. Aspen Ski Company is owned by the Crown family that owns 16% in General Dynamics. Figure it out, folks. That's a military company, and everyone thinks that Aspen is the most liberal place on earth and brags about being the first town in America to go 100% renewable. Let me take a breath and toss it back to you all.
Well, that's amazing litany of facts you've given us, Arn. I mean, thank you for that. The military, I don't know if you mentioned that the military itself is one of the greatest polluters. You said 100 companies, and I was going to ask you about that. I'm glad you
Right.
brought it up. And it's only 100 companies. It's only a small number of people making these decisions that we're trying to pressure here. That's a crux of the problem. There are a lot of good people, adults, who want to do that, who agree with you, but they can't because the power is in too few hands. But to go back to, it is true that the Pentagon, how much are they responsible for polluting the earth?
Well, to put it in size, it's the size of Sweden, that our own defense industry produces as much CO2 emissions as the country of Sweden, which I think that ranks it as something like 50th in the world. And that's not even taking into consideration when we bomb the living heck out of a country and what happens right now when there is an oil refinery that's burning. And then the other thing, Joe, to bring into this, to make people clear, I'm just a snow farmer from Western Colorado, okay? I raced mountain bikes for 20 years, and so I know how important it is to make sure that every second counts in a race. And I would say we have to always tell this story. 34 states are in Republican control. The federal juris bench is in corporatist control. How are we going to get legislation passed? Let's play this out, folks. I want to play out two things. One, for all those people who are passing the joint, let's think about this. We get somebody elected and president in 2 years. They have to go ahead and try to get something passed in order to make a complete overhaul change. Whatever that is, I would submit it would have to be a sort of eco-socialist type of legislation that would have to have social justice, like the $15 an hour minimum wage that's talked about, universal health care. That means that the Senate has to flip. We need 3 seats in order to flip the Senate. And the likelihood of that happening ain't so good, because that means Cory Gardner's got to go, and that the senator from Maine, Collins, has to go, and we have to keep Jones in Alabama, and he's not exactly the greatest liberal Democrat in the country. Then we have to get all of the agencies of government to be able to put this piece of legislation in some type of accountable regulation that could be used. And anytime there's a lawsuit against this, it's going to be taken to the federal district courts. That is not possible. That's why I say right now we have to get into the streets, and we have to do the right type strategic direct actions where, like today, where we're actually, think about this, we're having this conversation. I've been honored to be on your show because teenagers sat in Nancy Pelosi's office. Teenagers sat in Nancy Pelosi's office, and that's why we have something called the Green New Deal, which I ran on 4 years ago. Now we have the new Green Deal, which doesn't have a strategic plan as to how to implement it.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about relating to this, the climate strike specifically, is to what extent do you think this effort to address the climate crisis that we're all facing is inextricably linked to our efforts to kind of, I don't want to say populism, I don't want to say overthrow, but essentially to push back against a plutocratic oligarchic system that we have? Because it seems to me that those two efforts are so intertwined that without one or the other, there will be no real change on the climate. There will be no facing this, because the plutocrats that we have running the system of power that we all live in are self-interested, and I would say as a collective psychopathic, to the point that they don't see an interest in changing the status quo. And I just wanted your thoughts on that. So
I mean, you said it. I mean, we all know this. Many people are afraid to actually realize it, admit it, because they want to keep believing in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and unicorns. And that's what we're selling our children. You know, we know Princeton told us we're an oligarchy, for Christ's sake. You know, we don't have to be, you know, leftists saying this. I'm neither left nor right. I'm a radical. And when you look at follow the money, follow where all the legislation is written, it is to deregulate, it is to privatize, and it is, you know, to do those type of things. It isn't in order to help the middle class, the separation of the rich and poor for the past 40 years. I mean, we're forced into some type of indentured servitude, so we can't get out into the streets. And then in your earlier guest, and having worked with John Kiriakou and having worked with Daniel Ellsberg, you know, and I 5 years ago today, I was laying out in front of a prison for Jeffrey Sterling just so he could get help. You know, and all these whistleblowers, they come out, they start to say something. We live in a surveillance state. You know, as soon as we start to talk about this type of stuff, they know about it. Look at what happened. I was up in Standing Rock. Look at, there were FBI people who were inside working us and making sure that, so when we go out to do this, it's to protect the powers that be. And that's why I think it's important for me to understand this and say this often out loud. There was a shift somewhere after Reagan to the global corporate mafia. I think I stole that from Chris Hedges, who was talking about inverse totalitarianism and talking about corporate democracy. And what we distill that to is, who is the major corporations making the most amount of money, operating the most amount of the federal politicians? The finance industry. That's why you do sit-ins on Wall Street, because it's casino capitalism going on with the fracking industry, the military industry. That we live in a sort of weapons-based economy, the oil and gas, the big ag, big pharma, and the insurance. And then we could also add in the Israeli neocons that are operating our military strategy in the Middle East. So when you talk about, excuse me, when you talk about this, Elizabeth, I don't know why everyone just doesn't think this is common sense. They see this on Game of Thrones, or they see this in Stranger Things. I mean, I don't watch a lot of entertainment TV, and I don't follow sports anymore, because who would want to follow any of this other stuff when the reality is more weirder and more crazier, and the stakes are so high?
Unfortunately, I think you're right. And I think that's a really accurate yet dire, statement about the reality that we live in. And I agree that, whether it's Stranger Things or any of these other TV shows, in some ways they are much more mundane than the craziness of the world we actually live in. Joe.
Yes, I really liked the line you had before, Arn, when you said that we have to go after the Democrats, who are not denialists like some Republicans, but delayers. They know better. They went to Paris. They cobbled together a deal they knew had no enforcement mechanism, that was really just window dressing, wasn't it, Arn? And they are not getting serious about that. And it's all because of what we discussed, the profit, the greed, and the capitalist system that we live under that is preventing the change. It's more than, if the Chinese saw the US, and I probably do, maybe you could talk a little bit about China. We have As'ad AbuKhalil waiting for the next segment, if he doesn't mind waiting on another few more minutes. Can you tell us a little bit about the Chinese? Who is more, the Americans try to say the Chinese are more responsible than their own businessmen. And we know what the truth is.
Well, I don't have the figures top of mind, but there are percentages out there that China is emitting more CO2 emission and India. But again, another way of framing it is, by 2050, the world's population is supposed to be at 9 billion people. We're at about 7.3 right now. So there's going to be more use of energy. There's going to be more of this people who thinks that there's no limits to consumerism. One thing that we should think about with China, right or wrong, is they're moving very quickly on lowering the price of solar for us, because we can't do it ourselves. And the reason we have fracking right now is because it's cheaper than coal. And so if we could get to solar cheaper, but China is growing, and China has already agreed to do 300 coal plants in developing countries. We just shut down about 120 some coal plants in the last couple of years, and that's almost a third or half of our coal plants. So we have to be realistic in understanding that this is an entire world that is trying to go after something called energy in order to stay warm, in order to have their food, etc. And it's up to the fact that we all have to be leaders. And since we're kind of wrapping up, we have to look to the fact that a 16-year-old girl from Sweden who is autistic has captured the imagination of a globe. 2 years ago, she'll tell the story that she walked out of school on a Friday. She tried to talk to her politicians at the parliament. No one would listen to her. No one would listen to her. No one would listen to her. And this last week, just look at how many people are listening to her. That gives me, again, I don't necessarily have hope, but that gives me fuel in order to go out and do whatever it takes. Whatever it takes in order to stop the insanity of our addiction to fossil fuels and the way we eat and the way we travel.
No doubt that she and all those children are extremely inspiring, but at the same time, I feel a depression when I hear them, because it sounds like desperation coming from them and they're not being listened to. So I got to ask you for the final question, the UN summit coming up this Monday, I believe, in the UN General Assembly. Can we just expect a lot of lip service to the kids, how wonderful they are, and then all these world leaders will go back to their capitals and do nothing?
I have two answers. One is any large organization like the UN is a glacier moving slowly and destroying everything in its path. And then but I think that actually there is a synergy that's going on here and trying to push something forward, just like the UN tried to do something about Yemen, but there was a log jam. There is a possibility here. I thought you were going to say, what about the UN report that comes out next week on ocean? What we have to understand here is these reports that come out, a lot of this information, I just met with a group of scientists in Aspen who are putting these models and reports together. And they'll tell you that this isn't going to be anything necessarily new information on the ocean report. It's just going to be how they explain it so that we understand it better and can use it better. What we have to look for is in 2100, there's something called the Assessment Report 6, AR6, that will come out. We're working off of AR5. That's where they actually do this intense modeling of what happens. And guess what, folks? There's a lot of they don't know about what they don't know elements. They are still trying to figure out the melting Arctic and what happens when the methane gas is released from the lands there. They still don't quite understand what happens when tropical forests like the Amazon or the Sahara are burning and what happens to that. But we do know this, 50% of our oxygen comes from the ocean, 93% of CO2 emission by man has been absorbed by the ocean. So it's only going to get worse. I've made that very, very clear. And I would say to people who are a little derangedly depressed, like I can be sometimes, the best way to get over it is to get outside of yourself and do something about it. I've been honored to have Joe allow me to write for Consortium News and talk about solutions. I never would have thought that was possible, but you keep working at it, and you go into Washington or you go to your state senators and you go, the one thing we didn't touch on, we're not pressing the media, which is the corporately owned media, which is in bed with all of the people that we talked about. And that's why we're getting these insipid questions asked of presidential candidates. We've got to get them to ask tighter, smarter questions.
Well, Arn, we were very happy to publish your piece. It was a very good one. So the thanks is to you, and I thank you for joining us and spending some of your evening to talk about today's climate strike and the dire situation we're in, and there might be a glimmer of hope in all of this. And if there was, you helped provide it. So thank you, Arn.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Now, Arn mentioned Yemen and the UN, and that's a perfect segue to our next topic. As'ad AbuKhalil is standing by in Modesto, California. Thank you for joining us this evening. So we move from one depressing topic to another.
Right.
Climate crisis to situation, what has dramatically taken place since last weekend. Even in a schoolyard fight, you have to sometimes find out who started it. So the war in Yemen, it was the Saudis who started that war. And it's not as if these missiles came out of the blue and struck their oil facilities last Saturday. Now, I want to ask you, As'ad, we're going to talk a little bit in depth about the Yemen war, how it began. I was at the UN there, and Jamal Ben Omar was the UN envoy there, and he told me that he believed the Saudis started this war because they were very close to a deal. The Houthis had agreed to evacuate Sana'a. They had agreed to 30% representation capped in the parliament, and women would have 30%. And the only thing they couldn't agree on, there was going to be a UN force trained to come in and replace them in the capital. Well, the only thing they couldn't agree on was the role of the presidency. Hadi was in Saudi Arabia was insisting on remaining the top guy, and there were some proposals that there would be a rotating presidency like they had in Yugoslavia for a while, or there would be a strong vice president. But the Saudis started bombing, and this war is still going on, and they got hit pretty badly. And the way it's framed in the corporate media is this is just some kind of crazy terrorist attack, not in the context of a war. So As'ad, thank you for joining us. And and the other main thing we're going to talk about is the U.S. response to this.
Right.
My view, and I could be wrong, is the U.S. Iran has calculated that the U.S. really cannot respond militarily, certainly not in a large way, because the consequences to the region, to the United States itself, to the world economy with a US election coming up will be too great. And there are some grown-up people maybe in the Pentagon who have figured this out, and I think the Iranians may have figured that out, and that's why this attack happened, not directly from Iran, but most likely from Houthis, who they don't have complete control over either. Anyway, As'ad, I've said a lot, so let's just pick it up where you'd like to.
Well, I think your intro is quite apt about how the Saudi government did not want a peaceful settlement in Yemen whatsoever. And I think it's fair to say that Yemen has been at war on and off since the 1960s, and largely because of Saudi Arabia and largely because of its same sponsors. I mean, people forget there was a very long bloody war in Yemen in the 1960s, and it had the same characters. There were feuding parties inside Yemen, and of course, the Saudis will always make sure to support the worst, and the United States always picks the most reactionary, most conservative. And they were supporting the royalists. The Republicans were supported by the progressive leadership of Nasser in Egypt at the time. And the Israelis were involved, just like they are now, behind the scenes, but not so covertly. It's all around. And I think the Saudis do not want to have a progressive government in Southern Arabia. People forget the only Marxist government in the Arab world that ever took place was in the 1970s in South Yemen. And that was an exemplary government when it came to rights of women, secularism, progressiveness, social justice, all these things that ostensibly liberals care about, but in reality, when they are served to Arabs by Arabs, they are opposed by liberals in the West because they clash with the colonial project and imperial interest, which far more supersede the interests of native colored people over there. So we are seeing a refighting of the war in Yemen with similar characters. The only absence now is that the Houthis are not progressive, but certainly the most reactionary parties in Yemen would always be the ones that are handpicked by the Saudis, President Hadi, who you mentioned, and he doesn't control any agenda. Basically, he is a client of the Saudis, whatever they want. It is fair to say, Joe, that just as in Israeli elections, especially by Labour Party leaders, the so-called left, whenever there was an election, the Labour Party, if they were in government, they tried to enhance their electoral credential and fortunes by committing a massacre, usually in Lebanon. For much of the 1980s and 1990s, we witnessed Prime Minister Shimon Peres and others, they want to establish how tough they are against the Arabs by massively bombing Lebanon, refugee camps in Lebanon, and so on. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was attempting to do something similar like the Israelis. He was new to the scene. He wanted to announce himself in a big way, in an Israeli way, by showing how tough he was. And the calculation was that he is going to finish this war fairly quickly. And the accomplices of this horrific project were none other than the Obama administration officials. And you were at the UN, and you knew full well how supportive Samantha Power, who has a new book out about her idealism and humanitarianism, how supportive they were of the Saudis, how much they tried to shield them, protect them from any criticism at the United Nations. And the Obama administration gave them full support on the calculation is not going to go that far. Only when it got so out of hand, then you have very mild criticism at the very end of the Obama administration. And what we are witnessing now is that a failure of the colonial project in Yemen in order to subdue the rebellions of the Houthis. And what people do not report is that the Houthis, they were not widely popular when they started. But what happened is, and I know from Yemenis here in America who have nothing to do with the Houthis and who do not support Iran, but the devastation and the brutality of American, Saudi, UAE bombings of Yemen is so indiscriminate that people became so hostile to the other forces. And that gave support for the Houthis inside Yemen, surprisingly. And the Saudis, now they are pressured by the Americans, from what we read, that they have to conclude this war. And the Iranians are basically increasing their support for the Houthis because they know now it is a regional conflict. It is not a small conflict. It never was a small conflict. Yemeni conflict started largely as an attempt by Saudi Arabia to impose its will throughout Arabia and to enhance the credentials of this new young tough leader who is modeling himself after Netanyahu. Well, that didn't go well at all. It went so bad that the Saudis and the Emiratis inside Yemen are clashing and fighting against each other. And some of them even made allies with Al-Qaeda, the forces that the United States was fighting inside Yemen. And people do not realize that the horrific, corrupt regime of Yemen was set up by a combination of forces, including the US and Saudi Arabia. And as long as that guy was doing the bidding, he was supported by Democrats and Republicans in America, as always. Only when the people of Yemen made it very clear they are not going to accept his leadership, there was an attempt to arrange for a fictitious transition. This was no transition. They replaced the tyrant with his hand-picked successor, a man who is totally corrupt, has no credential or popularity inside Yemen. This is very much like Hillary Clinton's solution to the turmoil in Egypt in 2011. When the people of Egypt revolted, people forget, initially, the Obama administration stood by them fairly soon. Only when they realized the Egyptian people will under no circumstances, would accept the leadership of Mubarak, and despite pressure by Netanyahu and the Saudi king, Obama basically realized it's not going to continue. So then Hillary came up with her ingenious plan. If you remember correctly, she wanted to replace the tyrant with his hand-picked head of the secret police, Omar Suleiman. And then, of course, they realized that people are not going to go for that. And of course, then there was an election, the wrong man won. And whenever the wrong man wins in third world countries, the United States is always ready around the corner to prepare an alternative. And that's when the dictatorship, the military dictatorship took place inside Egypt. As far as the calculation of the Iranians, Joe, I am not sure that the Iranians have calculated that the United States is not going to war. I think they read American politics well enough to know that there is an array of forces now at play, putting so much pressure on Trump in order to go to war. I mean, look at the consensus. We have never seen, I mean, people in Washington, the media, the think tank people, and the human rights shops are all in agreement against Trump. They criticize Trump and they mock Trump and so on. But the only time we remember in the Trump administration when they were very pleased with his performance was when he ordered the bombing of Syria. Everybody then thought how presidential he was. We are witnessing a similar cycle. If you look at the Twitter account of the Obama officials, you will find all of them, as well as Republican pundits, and Senator Lindsey Graham is a good spokesperson of this crowd. They want war. They want to go to war. And former Secretary of Defense in his book, Robert Gates, said that the Saudis want America to go to war against Iran to the last American. Of course, he was not courageous enough to add to the last American also on behalf of Israel. Israel has been, I mean, the lobby of war includes Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, of course, notably, the Washington scene, the establishment of Washington. They all want to go to war. And it has to be said that Trump is the most resistant to this war agenda in the Middle East right now. I mean, I would be certain that if it was Obama or Bush, they would have gone to war already. I mean, this is not so much a defense of Trump, but it is as the fact that the Republicans and Democrats are far more warmongering than Trump. The Iranians, I think, are calculating that there is a possibility of war. And what they are trying to prove is this. When they attacked, I mean, if they attacked shipping in the Gulf, when they took over that British barge and so on, and now with the attacks, if they were behind it, even though the claim was made by the Houthis, if they were behind the attack on the oil installation, which is responsible for 5.7 million of barrels of oil a day, which is more than 50% of oil production of Saudi Arabia, which is drastically influencing to the oil market. I mean, there was a 10% increase the first day of that bombing. What they are doing is to say, if there is going to be war, and even if there is not going to be war, because Iran, from its own standpoint, forget about the government, the people of Iran feel they are now being victims of a war that is declared by the United States, and they are suffering in their economic livelihood. And we have a saying in Arabic, I mean, to cut somebody's sources of livelihood is like cutting somebody's throat. And the Iranians feel they are victims of a war, and they want to prove to the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates that we will take the war to you. And these are very fragile, vulnerable governments. And Trump himself in his campaign said famously and accurately that those regimes would not have survived throughout the decades if it wasn't for US direct protection, military protection. And we saw that the Iranian policy of trying to take this conflict to these governments have worked. Suddenly, United Arab Emirates announced that they are unilaterally withdrawing from Yemen. We saw also a decline in the bellicose rhetoric of both Saudi Arabia and UAE towards Iran. We also have seen visits, some announced, some unannounced, by UAE officials to Iran. And the Saudis are not as vocal as they were about Iran only maybe 6-7 months ago. I mean, so that policy is effective. Iran wants to strike at the weakest elements of the American empire, and these are the Gulf regimes. I mean, it takes only, and I know this from a confidential source in Lebanon. This happened like only maybe 3-4 years ago. There was a visit that was unannounced by a UAE official who went to Lebanon, and they were sending a message to Hezbollah to the effect that if only they would distance themselves from Iran, things would be better for them, or something to that effect. I'm not sure if this was an American message or a UAE message. And my informant told me, very highly placed, is that the message was given back to them was to the effect that if you think you can take war to Iran, the high towers of Dubai will be hit. And I think that that's a message that is being now delivered. They want to say that it is so easy to disrupt an economy based on tourism and financial center inside Dubai. And the Iranians want to make that threat very clear. Now, their calculation here is that America will not go to war, and I think this is what you were alluding to, that America will not go to war for the sake of these polygamous princes in the Gulf. And certainly Trump is less likely than Republican or Democratic presidents previous to go to war for the sake of these polygamous princes and kings. And thus far, it has proven to be accurate what they are doing. The only thing is, things could get out of control. And if shots are fired, if American troops are hit, if pressure mounts in Congress against Trump in order to go to war, things could change. But thus far, I think Iranian calculations have delivered a very strong message to America's allies that you will not be spared bloodshed if it was visited on Iran.
To quote that great philosopher Mike Tyson, the boxer, everybody has an argument till you get punched in the face. So right. This was a message that Iran was sending to Saudi Arabia. If you start a war, this is the kind of damage that could be done to you. Now,
or if the sanctions continue as they are, without our ability to sell oil, we will also visit it upon you.
Well, the reaction of the Trump administration was more sanctions. Now, Lindsey Graham and all the others up on Capitol Hill can scream their heads off and all their rhetoric, but there are people over here in the Pentagon, here in Northern Virginia where I am, that actually calculate things out. And they, right. If they're being honest, and there will be, at least show to their superiors, they could show the absolute devastation that would result. And they just got a taste of it. That's what you're saying. Iran just gave them a taste of it. They want to crush, even without Bolton there, they want to crush Iran, obviously, all these people you mentioned. But can they realistically do that without suffering too much? It will not be a useful victory for the United States. And they probably in the end would destroy Iran and its infrastructure and its government, but at an enormous cost. And we've seen a little bit of that. Aren't they recalculating now at the Pentagon, even inside the White House, about what this would mean? Shouldn't they be? Or, I mean, I can't imagine they aren't.
Well, I mean, I think what is ironic since Vietnam is that the military in America has become the least eager for war compared to the other establishment segment of the government, of the power elite, because the military knows that they will have to do the fighting and the dying, and they have seen the cost of that to them. I mean, the people, the civilians of Iraq and Afghanistan, nobody cares about that, not in the United States for sure. They don't even do counting, as they say now anymore, of these victims of the other side. So I cannot imagine a situation where these military generals will come to Trump with some scenarios of war in which he would say, let's go. I think they are capable of providing these accurate, deadly and scary scenarios that will make him very reluctant. And of course, another time I cite Robert Gates, where he gave a speech at the end of his term as Secretary of Defense at West Point, and he famously said, any president who ever considered going to war in the Middle East again would have to have his head examined. The cost of that is going to be tremendous. Iran is not Iraq on many levels. One, it's a much larger country. Two, it has a much larger population. Three, it has so many much more resources and a much more military resources than Iraq. And fourthly, the leadership of Iran, is far more calculating, certainly much more intelligent than Saddam Hussein's foolish leadership and his inability to read the world scene and so on. Fifthly, unlike Iraq, which had no support in the region whatsoever, not only Iran has segment of support, it has its own allies that are armed to the teeth, and they are close to the border of Israel, the dear, cuddled, spoiled child of the American empire. And that makes the cost of any confrontation with Iran very high, not only militarily and politically. And I think if Iraq, which was totally exhausted, when the United States invaded Iraq, people forget, it was destroyed. America has already destroyed it in 1991, and with the bombing that never stopped throughout the 1990s, and with very stiff sanctions that even prevented the arrival of pencils to the children of Iraq because they were deemed dangerous because the lead inside them could be used for military purposes. That was the calculation of the Clinton administration. People forget that. And it is for this reason. So if Iraq, that was exhausted and fatigued and weakened, was able to drag the US into this protracted conflict from which it has not been able to extricate itself, and it doesn't seem to want to extricate itself, you can imagine what an Iran confrontation would look like. For that reason, I cannot see, even if there's pressure on Trump, and if he were to order bombing, so on, it is not going to be a major confrontation. He's not going to dispatch troops. And also, as General Mattis said before he was Secretary of Defense, when he was still in the armed forces, he said that the Israel question posed a danger to the safety of US troops because it creates such hostility to America's presence in the region, as if people do not mind America's presence without Israel, but it adds to it. And that means that the 5,000 troops in Iraq, at least 5,000, and at least 2,000 in Syria, and 14,000 in Afghanistan, they will be quite vulnerable because Iran has the capability, if it wants, to bomb American targets.
And the Pentagon knows that very well. What was the reaction of the Saudis? You read the regional press. It didn't seem to be as robust as you might expect. It was like a bully that somebody stood up to. The way I see, they didn't really respond with as much bellicosity as I would have thought.
You're absolutely right. They feel also rather embarrassed. They are embarrassed. And even in the New York Times today, you start to see the beginning of the criticism of Trump, which is very new in the Saudi and in the UAE press. But this is always the pattern of Saudi treatment of any US administration. Remember when Obama first arrived, he was hailed and praised in Saudi Arabia. By the end of his term, of course, they were starting to criticize him. And some people were suspecting that he was a secret Shiite who harbored love for the Iranian people out of his own doctrinal theology. I'm seeing for the first time this week criticism of the Trump administration. And basically, the Gulf despots are always disappointed. They always want America to give them more support. This is why they are building a relationship with Israel, assuming, wrongly of course, that the Israeli state is going to come to their rescue with Israeli soldiers in order to save them, which of course is not going to happen. Of course, the Israelis still support them as it has for many years and decades, but it's not going to go to war for their own sake. It has its own agenda. And Israel, of course, now is inside the domestic turmoil, which makes it very unlikely to be part of a major military advance anywhere in the region. The Saudis now, on the one hand, want to blame Iran for public relations purposes, propaganda purposes, but on the other hand, they are softening the rhetoric. They are not making the kind of statement that they used to make, because I think that they know if they continue to escalate the rhetoric, they have to take it to the logical conclusion, which is to strike at Iran. And if that occurs, I mean, they are declaring war on Iran officially, even though they have unofficially, and that will take this entire conflict to another level and would give Iran a reason to attack, and this time directly and openly, targets inside Saudi Arabia or maybe UAE. But I should also mention that there was an announcement that didn't get much attention 2 days ago in the independent Arabic section. I mean, people forget that the independent newspaper, which we progressives used to like and read so many times over the years, has become now in the custody of a business person who is tied to the Saudi government. And the Arabic section is now run by the propaganda apparatus of Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince. And the independent Saudi Arabia version announced 2 days ago that they were part of the coalition that bombed Iranian targets inside Syria. Now that's new. And the Iranians have not responded to that publicly from what I've seen. Could the Iranians take that as an opportunity for another strike, a direct strike or not? I don't know. But I also know that there are negotiations going on as we speak. I think the channels of communication between Iran and the United States are open. The fact that Iranian leaders are saying, we will not negotiate until these terms and so on, tells me that they are negotiating indirectly through the Japanese, through the French, and through the Omanis. So there is a situation of negotiations going on. And I think this was what the Trump administration wanted. I mean, Trump, as we know, is not a man of details. He doesn't know much about public policy or foreign policy. But he is very much driven by fame, by vanity, and by an attempt to leave an imprint on history. And the agreement, the nuclear agreement that had the thumb and the name of Obama is what caused his consternation. He wants to leave history with peace agreement and negotiated settlements that carry the name of Trump, just like casinos do and hotels and apartment buildings. And that has not materialized yet. It hasn't in North Korea and hasn't in Iran. He may now find out through this indirect negotiations with the Iranians that perhaps an agreement with Iran is far more within closer reach than a possible agreement in North Korea. And for that reason, this could expedite the process of messages back and forth with Iran and the United States in the next few weeks and months, and perhaps during the United Nations negotiations.
That brings me to the question I wanted to ask you about how the removal of John Bolton might figure into the calculations that Joe mentioned just a few minutes ago regarding, the US's view on the feasibility of war with Iran, as well as the attitude of Iran towards the United States and the Saudis and its allies.
The Russian government is also part of the negotiations that's going on, and they have very good relations with the Iranians, and they have good relations with the Israelis, so they are part of the picture as well. But I think the Iranians are now focusing all their energies on trying to expose the vulnerability and the fragility of the Gulf despot, to tell the world and to tell them that even if they may not strike at the US directly, even without the US firing any shot at Iran, that they will continue to escalate as long as they suffer from these stiff sanctions.
Now, another thing I wanted to ask you about was Caitlin Johnstone, a great independent journalist, recently took some shots at Mike Pompeo for using a line that was basically straight out of the satirical Onion outlet, basically saying that any attack on Saudi oil isn't an act of war against the United States. I wanted to get your take on that, the degree to which we've kind of, lost the ability to even satirize these types of moves by the United States.
Right, but we notice also, Pompeo, unlike Bolton, is much more malleable and much more susceptible to direct orders from Trump to change his mind and to change his rhetoric. I noticed on one day he said that, the next day he's emphasizing, even from the Gulf, that the answer is a peaceful settlement. And I think the announcement by the Trump administration today about the intensification of sanctions, and of course he wants to make it the most stiff sanctions ever produced, as if the sanctions against Iraq in the 1990s could have been in any way stiffer than they were. As I said, denying the children of Iraq medicine and school supply, how more stiff that it could have been. And I think that the announcement is basically, they are not resorting to the military option thus far. But accident could happen. Accident could happen. What if Iran attacks a target inside a Gulf country and they mistakenly hit US troops or something like that? So things could get out of hand.
moving forward? How dangerous do you think this is? I mean, could this, with the support of Russia that Iran has and the larger geopolitical situation, I mean, do you think that this type of conflict, if some sort of horrible accident did happen, I mean, could that have the potential of dragging us into what we might call World War III, or do you think that would be avoided somehow?
Far from sounding as supporter of the Trump administration, and I think many of us on the left now are accused of not being critical enough of Trump. But the reality is, it's not so much being defensive about Trump, but it's like Republican and Democrats are far worse. They are much more the war lobby. They have had decades to invest in a war project that has continued unabated in more than 70 places in the world since the Second World War. And it is for that reason I feel Trump personally would be more resistant to that than previous president. And that, I think, is a calming influence. The other thing have to be said is that mistakes are possible, but the Iranians are also very calculating. And the Saudis and the UAE are not wild. They know how vulnerable they are. And they know their economies are very fragile. I mean, if you cut the supply of oil and if you affect tourism in Dubai, I mean, what's left? I mean, their economies would collapse and they would not be the fabulously wealthy monarchy that they are. So I think that there are different reasons why different parties in this conflict are less willing to go wild.
As'ad, you mentioned that the Saudis thought that Obama may have been a Shiite lover. Of course, that was during the negotiation for the nuclear deal with Iran. And after. Sorry?
And after the deal.
And after the deal. However, during the deal is when the war against Yemen began. And I've theorized, and I want to know what you think, that Obama said, calculated, listen, let's divert their attention, give them something, and they'll get off our back and we can go through with the Iranian deal. Is that, you agree with this?
You're absolutely right. And in fact, I do not recall right now who in the Obama administration all but admitted that America's role as an enabler of the Saudi war on Yemen was a payback for the fact that they were upset and hurt by the agreement with Iran. No doubt about it, no doubt. I mean, they protected them at the UN, as I said. They gave them so much military and intelligence support and so on. So certainly that was the calculation. They thought that would appease them, but they didn't know that it was much more than that they were requiring. They wanted at that time an all-out war on Iran, and they didn't get it. And now they are frustrated. And now they realize there is not going to be war. But now they realize something else. They realize war or no war, things as they stand, Saudis will be paying the price. The UAE will be paying the price. So I think now Iran, by its movement and bombing, if they were behind it, have changed the calculus on the part of its enemies in the Gulf.
The question of whether Iran was behind is interesting because Obama's State Department spokesman at the time the war began actually made this statement. You can look it up. He said that Iran does not have operational influence in Yemen. So at that time, given that they're from different branches of Shiism as well, and the fact that Yemen was awash with weapons, as every UN diplomat was saying, they didn't need weapons from Iran at that point. Now, has that changed? I think you inferred that Iran has gotten more involved than they were at the beginning.
There's no question about that. I mean, if you look at WikiLeaks, American diplomatic cables from this century indicated that the Saudis have widely exaggerated the links between Iran and the Houthis. The links were really small. And also even theologically, there is worlds apart between them. Here in the media, of course, they use shorthand. Shiites this and Shiite that. In reality, they are as far apart as mainstream Sunnis and mainstream Shiites are. After the war, however, the Houthis felt, from their standpoint, they have no choice but to deepen ties with the Iranians. And the Iranians, on the other hand, as the conflict in the region escalated, felt that we can resort to support the Houthis as a way to get back at Saudi Arabia. So there's no doubt that things have definitely increased. And we see that the firepower of the Houthis have increased. But we should remember that much of the weapons that the Houthis have used, even against Saudi Arabia, were supplied to Yemen by the American government in previous administration, Democrat and Republican. That's largely unsaid. The Yemeni dictator of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, was owned by the Americans, not by the Soviet government. I should also say that, in case there is a military escalation, Iran, on Iran, the Houthis will feel that they were part of it, because the Houthis will get more hit by the Saudis, and the Iranians will feel the Saudis deserve to be hit by them or by the Houthis, who are strategically located south of Saudi Arabia.
You mentioned the Russians before, and this is quite interesting because there was a resolution. Nobody mentions it anymore. It was not a binding one. In other words, it wasn't a Chapter 7 resolution, which binding to usually use when force is authorized. They use Chapter 7. It was a Chapter 6 resolution, but it did say that Hadi was the president of Yemen, and it kind of in a way, it did not discourage. Let's put it. I don't remember the exact language now, but let's put it this way: the Saudis have interpreted it as an authorization for them to go in to Yemen. Russia abstained on that resolution. I actually asked number 2. I think he was in the Russian mission at an American reception. That's all you do at the UN is go to receptions. And I asked him, why did you abstain on that? Why didn't you veto that resolution? And he literally dropped the drink that he had in his hand to the ground and walked away. Now, I don't know whether that was intentional or not, but why didn't Russia try to stop that? If you recall the resolution I'm talking about, As'ad, why didn't they do more to stop the Saudis from going in there?
Well, I think it's fair to say, and you know the UN much more than I do, or most people do, I would say that the watershed of the Russian attitude to a resolution of the UN was 2011, and the UN Security Council Resolution 1973 authorized the use of force for protection of civilians in Libya, which the American government took as a license to basically invade and attack and cause so much mayhem and destruction in Libya. I mean, Libya is still suffering from that wrong-headed Obama administration exploitation, illegal exploitation of a United Nations resolution. Since then, the Chinese and the Russians have realized that the Americans are capable of exploiting any resolution under Chapter 7 to their own ends. And they don't allow that. Whether it's through abstention, whether it's through vetoing, they are going to hold firm on that, I think, especially in the Middle East region, because they know of the American insatiable appetite for war and conflict and domination in that region. I mean, I think that the Russian government, I mean, is selecting its conflict with the Americans, but it has increased, though. I mean, Russian opposition to UN design, to US design in the Security Council, and Chinese opposition has been increasing as well since 2011. And that has really reduced the ability of the US to use the UN, since it has done, since the end of the Cold War, to its very end, to its own end. And this is something that was clearly mentioned in the book by Brent Scowcroft and George Herbert Walker Bush, which said that on one page that we basically will use the UN as a cover for our own designs. And they have done that. Now it's more difficult.
That's been the MO of the United States vis-a-vis the UN almost from the beginning.
Right.
Certainly in recent
more so since the end of the Cold War. Yeah.
Yeah, after 9/11, after the invasion of Iraq, for example, they didn't get the resolution, and they did whatever they wanted anyway. But if they could get one, you know, it's useful. I'm reminded of a story back that you know very well, I'm sure, 1934. This is a story that Mohammed bin Salman should know. Right. That in 1934, King Abdulaziz Al Saud, the first king of Saudi Arabia, of that, the third version of Saudi Arabia or whatever, told John Philby, the British agent, quote, "My fathers and grandfathers didn't own Yemen, and no one has been able to achieve security and stability there. Who can rule Yemen with its Saidis and its problems?"
Right, right.
That's something maybe that they should have heeded before they went in there.
Joe, the Saudi hegemony over Yemen is such that the family, the royal family, would appoint one of the princes to be in charge of Yemen. Like, Yemen would have its own sovereign government, and they would appoint a prince. For long years, it was Prince Sultan, the Minister of Defense. He was basically the man, the viceroy of Yemen. Even when Yemen had communist government, you know what that meant? They meant either you dominate the northern government at the time, and then things are well, and if you cannot control the government of the south, then you undermine it. I mean, the reason why the only Marxist Arab Republic fell is by virtue of American, Saudi designs and covert wars and operations against them during the Cold War, in the war against communism.
Well, As'ad, back to Russia for a second. That the Libyan resolution was when Medvedev was president, and the story goes that Putin, prime minister with less power, was furious about this. Wouldn't let it happen again. This Yemen vote came with Putin in charge. So I don't know if there's some kind of deal there, if he was distracted, or if he didn't see with Chapter 7, he didn't have to bother. I don't know, but I don't know if that would have helped.
I mean, do you think Medvedev would dare to make a decision about a UN resolution like that without consulting with his prime minister, Putin, at the time?
I don't know. But maybe Putin screwed up and he's blaming him. I don't know. But that's the way the story goes now.
I mean, Putin must. I mean, I think they must not. I mean, you learn in foreign policy, right? I mean, they must have assumed that the U.S. under no circumstances would be able to exploit a resolution that only speaks about the protection of civilians as a license for invasion, right? Who would have thought that? But if you know American history well, you would think that this is a no-brainer, right? They're going to exploit it.
Of course. Now, one would think, if one had sane mind and a diplomatic bent, of thinking that this should be the call to get a solution to the war in Yemen, that this cannot escalate, and now the real diplomatic effort has to be made to solve this Yemeni crisis as a first step towards some kind of lessening of tensions and some kind of normalization between the Saudi camp and the Iranians. But that ain't going to happen, is it, As'ad?
No, on the contrary, Joe. I feel now, ironically, as close as we are to the brink, this could be the occasion for all the sides to basically try to achieve a peaceful settlement. I mean, if you look at all the sides of the conflict, I mean, the Americans, under Trump, I should say, Trump does not want a military confrontation. So there's one side. Saudis and the UAE now have been hit directly and are far less warmongering than they've ever been. And they may be more interested than ever today. I mean, that's the irony of arriving at a settlement with their enemy, Iran. You have also on the side of the Iranian government, Iran is clearly suffering from the sanctions and they would like relief. And they know only an agreement with the Trump administration would achieve that. And I think that what we may basically receive is an agreement similar with longer terms for how long it will take for the Iranian to break the threshold of creating a bomb, with tighter limitations and so on, as well as, I mean, there were two other factors that were mentioned by the Trump administration, right? They wanted to add the ballistic missile and they wanted to add the Iranian role in the region, support for its lines and so on. That's not going to change. There is no way on earth that's going to change, because that is, in the absence of nuclear bomb, that is one of the assurances that Iran has, especially on the border with Israel, for its own survival. But I think they may have accept limits on ballistic missile production or things like that, or testing. And I think this could be possible. I do not rule it out. We could be close to that. And that's why I am much less alarmed about possibility of war after the hit on the Saudi oil fields. Because also America knows, and Trump is, if anything, he is obsessed with the economic situation and numbers, especially in election year, but even if there's no election year. And any disruption in the oil production is gonna mean tremendous rise in oil prices. I mean, people talk about strategic reserves. I mean, strategic reserves are really limited. I mean, given our consumption of oil here in this country or in the world, I mean, strategic reserves, Saudi Arabia and America would last only a few months. I mean, it's not like we have them to last for several years, which is enough in order to, balance the market again. But it's not like that.
Well, I also think there's a less likely chance of war after this hit, as I said at the beginning, but I didn't go as far as what you're suggesting. There could be a conference, a Berlin conference, a conference in Paris somewhere, out of the region, bringing all the leaders together and working out these things. That would be obviously where you have to go. And one sign that may be on the cards is if Trump indeed meets Rouhani in New York next week at the General Assembly. There was talk of that happening. Macron wanted to do it. Both sides said it ain't going to happen anymore, but who knows?
Well, I mean, I think we saw evidence of that also in Beatrice in the G7 summit, right? The fact that the Iranian foreign minister flew there, he met with Macron, but he did not meet with Trump. That in itself indicated that Iranian rhetoric sometimes is much higher than what's going on behind the scenes. We've seen that before they agreed to negotiate with the Obama administration as well. So sometimes the Iranians are as duplicitous as governments in the region. They may be raising slogans that are very anti-American while their messengers, diplomats, are negotiating secretively with American diplomats.
Right. The G7 or G7 took place, of course, before the attack on the oil installations. But if we see Rouhani and Trump meeting next week, maybe we have some hope that everyone realizes here they don't want this war. Nobody's really going to win in the end.
Right. I mean, the meeting with Rouhani, I think, is unlikely. It's too soon.
Yeah.
There has to be pre-summit negotiations from which the Iranians are going to get some guarantees of some sort. I mean, look, Iran is far more seasoned and calculating and experienced in international diplomacy and reading the American foreign policy than the North Korean leader, right? And even Kim Jong-un did not trust the Americans. He is not going to disarm in return for promises. He wanted some ironclad assurances and lifting of sanctions. When he didn't get that, he walked away. And I mean, this is an inexperienced leader. So imagine the Iranians. It's going to take some material, physical rewards.
If the Trump administration doesn't attack Iran right now in retaliation for the starting a war in Yemen, could the Democrats, we're in an election season now, use that against him and say, look, he's weak on Iran?
No doubt. And I think that, some Republicans would even participate in this charade. There is clearly thirst for a response by the Americans. And the thing is, don't you like the word response? I mean, when they use the word response, it's like as if America has been attacked like another Pearl Harbor. I mean, this is Saudi Arabia. This is a Saudi oil installation. And the United States is not tied of mutual defense treaty with Saudi Arabia. And I think if anything, it has also exposed to Saudi Arabia that despite their exorbitant expenditure on military warfare and equipment, it hasn't protected them. The Saudi people are now aware it has all been merely an investment in American approval and support for Saudi royal family. And these expenditures are not going to protect them. America is not going to protect them. This is why the Saudis have no choice but to negotiate with the Iranians and even to pressure the Americans to negotiate with the Iranians.
Well, so today the United States announced they're sending troops and air defense systems to Saudi Arabia. Can they array Patriot missiles to protect the oil fields?
Well, we've seen the Patriot missiles, just as the Iron Dome of Israel, are really impressive on paper, but in actuality, they hit far less than what they are advertised to be. And I like how they always take them back to the drawing board after every war, say that we have now a new version that is far more improved than the previous version. And then there is war, and we find that they make fantastic claim in the beginning of we shot 90% of all missiles, and then we only learn after some scientists at MIT conduct a new study that 5% or 7% actually were intercepted.
No refund to the taxpayer for that, by the way.
Yeah, right.
As'ad AbuKhalil is a professor of politics in California, at Modesto, California. And I really appreciate you coming on to talk Iran. And I hope that you are correct, that we are not going to get involved in a catastrophic conflict over this situation. So we really enjoyed our conversation with you and with Arn Menconi before that, and earlier with Peter B. Collins, as we talked about this Ukrainian scandal and the Assange update. So Elizabeth, I just want to say good night to you and to our audience. We're actually finishing on time tonight, a 2-hour show from 8 to 10. And we invite you to come next Friday again, same time, 8 p.m. Eastern time, for CN Live, episode 11. Good night, everyone.
Get out your notebook. There's more.